Okay, Chapter 10, the worlds of Christendom, Contraction, Expansion, and Division. 500 to 1300. This chapter is, it's a really great chapter. And actually, believe it or not, the European Middle Ages occupies a relatively small role in the AP World History course. The Byzantine Empire, with its connections to the rest of the world, is actually more significant. And when looking at the history of Christian Europe, try to use or continue to use a world history approach as opposed to a European history approach. Think about the larger trends and connections between areas over small-scale events of specific regions. And this chapter in particular focuses, or actually describes the Crusades, which acted as a critical moment of cross-cultural interaction. We need to think about how the Crusades affected both the Christian and the Islamic worlds. And even though the Crusades are discussed in a chapter on Christianity, exploring them from an Islamic perspective can help you strengthen your historical thinking skills of interpretation. Understand that the Crusades fostered significant interregional transfers in culture and technology. Okay, so our first image here. Let's think about who this man is. The person depicted on this page is Charlemagne, a king of the Franks. The Pope crowned him emperor in 800. And the empire over which he claimed authority included present-day France, Holland, Belgium, parts of Germany, and parts of Italy. Unfortunately, this kingdom broke apart shortly after his death, when his son split the empire into 3 parts. Let's take a look at his facial expression. Why do you think he is looking to the side? It's almost as if he seems to be looking suspiciously to his left. Given that it's a manuscript page, this could simply be an artist's choice by the author of the volume to have Charlemagne look to the opposite. It might also indicate Charlemagne's unease and awareness about the fragility of his empire. Finally, if you think about it, if you place the picture on a map of Charlemagne's kingdom, his gaze would turn toward southeast, which is Rome, and that would mean that his facial expression attests to his self-conscious effort at recreating a new Roman Empire. So let's look at the rest of the image. Can you see any cultural influences in this picture? The cross on the object in his left hand indicates the Christian identity of Charlemagne and his empire. The hand that seems to be reaching down toward his crown may also be a symbolic expression of divine protection of the ruler and his empire. And the Latin inscriptions, the roof over the throne and the columns are reminiscent of the Roman Empire and Roman architecture, which Charlemagne wanted to recreate. Now, about 700 years elapsed between what you see in this picture and the date the painting was created. So how might the passage of time have shaped the image? Well, the artist and the author of the manuscript was fully aware that Charlemagne came closer than most rulers after him in recreating a Roman Empire. And he also knew of the short-lived nature of that empire. Charlemagne's facial expression may be the artist's way of underlining something that the king of the Franks himself could not have known, but was glaringly obvious 700 years later, right? That his empire was short-lived and fragile. Okay, so over the past 30 years, millions have converted to the Christian faith in East and South Asia, and a similar process in the non-Muslim regions of Africa. And about 60% of Christians today live in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And in the 500s and 600s, Christianity also had flourishing communities across large regions in Afro-Eurasia. But over the next 1,000 years, African and Asian communities largely vanished, declined, or were marginalized, and Christianity became a largely European phenomenon. Now, by 1300, Christianity provided a common ground for third-wave societies in Western Eurasia. But Christendom was deeply divided. There was the Byzantine Empire and the West. The West, when Rome split into the eastern and western halves, the East became the Byzantine Empire, and the West essentially was just a chaotic mess of feudalism in Europe. These are the dark Middle Ages. Byzantium continued the traditions of the Greco-Roman world until it was conquered in 1453. And Eastern Orthodoxy evolved within this third wave civilization, which is just another branch of Christianity. There's a difference, a conflict, a difference in doctrine and church dogma between the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches, or in the Catholic Church, and that split and became the Catholic Church and then the Eastern Orthodox Church. Now, Roman imperial order basically disintegrated in the West. Like I said, it was chaos, the Dark Ages. This is when feudalism takes place. Most people didn't leave the manors or the estates their entire lives. Well, the serfs didn't, the peasants, because their feudal lords offered protection. Now, the Roman Catholic Church in the West was, established independence from political authorities, but the Eastern Orthodox Church did not. And Western Europe emerged at an increasing pace about after 1000 as a dynamic third wave civilization. And Western Europe was a hybrid civilization. Classical, Germanic, Celtic, all kind of mixed together. So the story of global Christendom in the era of third wave civilizations is really one of contractions and expansions. There were sharp contractions in Asia and Africa, but wide expansion in Western Europe and Russia. And Christian Byzantium contracted and unfortunately ultimately disappeared. In Western Europe, Christendom contracted but later expanded. Okay, so let's talk about Christian contraction in Asia and Africa. Islam spread was a driving force in the contraction of Christianity. And so we have the challenge of Islam, albeit in many cases of tolerance. While Christianity had spread through much of North Africa and the Middle East, this was an unexpected rise in this new monotheistic faith, and that meant the end of some Christian communities, especially in the Arabian Peninsula. However, the treatment of Christians was not uniform and was very much dependent on the attitude of the local Muslim rulers. In Syria, Jerusalem, and Armenia, Christian leaders negotiated agreements with the Islamic forces, and those Christian communities actually survived. So within a century or so of Muhammad's death, Christianity almost disappeared from Saudi Arabia, or the Arabian Peninsula, The Islamic forces seized Jerusalem and its holy sites. And those in Syria and Persia, many Christians actually converted voluntarily. Those that didn't were granted the right to practice their religion for payment of a special tax. Remember the Hijra, we've talked about that. And the experiences of individual communities was varied. The Nestorian Christians in the Middle East and China, in Syria, Iraq, and Persia, a Church of the East, and the Nestorians found accommodation with Islamic rulers. By not preaching to Muslims and by abandoning their sacred image, as it was offensive to Islam's rules against idolatry, which means taking an idol and creating an image of it. In China, the Nestorian Christians adapted to Chinese culture and used familiar terms to communicate the message of Jesus. And from the 600s to about the mid-800s, this church survived thanks to state tolerance. However, this changed when the dynasty moved against all foreign faiths, including Islam and Buddhism. The Nestorian Christians, or the Church of the East, like I said, survived, but it shrank in size. It had some success in Tang, China, and that's the time period that I'm talking about. But ultimately, like I said, it just kind of disintegrated. But there was a brief revival under the Mongols. The Mongols were tolerant in regards to issues of religion, and some even saw Jesus as a strong shaman and actually converted. Others preferred Christianity to Buddhism and Islam as they wanted to eat meat and drink alcohol, and it was unclear what impact Jesus' message of peace had on these fierce warriors of the steppes, the Mongols. Okay, African Christianity. Coastal North African Christians largely converted to Islam. In Egypt, the Coptic Church survived. It was actually tolerated by Muslim rulers until the Crusades and the Mongol threat, then it was suppressed. But most rural Coptic Christians converted and survived in the urban areas and remote monasteries. Now, the Christians in Egypt developed their own interpretations of the life of Jesus and their own Coptic language for worship. They were tolerated by Arab rulers until violent campaigns against them in the mid-14th century, and that was related to the Crusades and the Mongol invasion. And in the good years, Copts preferred, that's C-O-P-T-S, they preferred Arab rule to Byzantium, as the Greek Orthodox Church viewed them as heretics. So they viewed things a little bit differently. Now, Christianity was taking shape in the 5th and 6th centuries in the kingdoms of Nubia. It thrived for a time, but largely disappeared by 1500. Farther south in Nubia, Christianity flourished, and actually flourished there about 600 years. Many political leaders also held religious office. Like I said, yet by 1500, pressure from Egypt, conversions, and the Arab migrations kind of nipped that in the bud and put an end to that community. Now, there is an exception. That's Ethiopian Christianity. The rulers of Aksum adopted Christianity in the 4th century. And because of where they're located, their geography protected them from the surrounding Muslim world. And they developed distinctive traditions because of this isolation. It's in the highlands of Ethiopia. It's a unique form of Christianity developed here and survives until this day. Where about 60% of the population are Christian. And their isolation, like I said, from its Islamic neighbors and geography protected by the memories of the Ethiopian shelter of Muslim refugees from Mecca during the Prophet's life, the faith followed its own course without contact from other Christian churches. And so Ethiopians developed a fascination with Judaism and Jerusalem. And that is the end of section 1.